Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the podcast, produced in association with the Vegan Organic Network. I was lucky enough to go along to VegFest, which was held in Brighton at the end of March, where I recorded some of the speakers who performed in the veganic gardening arena. I'll be releasing a couple of these talks over the next month or so as bonus episodes, so if you're interested in vegan organic gardening, keep an eye out for those. This first episode is a recording of a talk given by veganic growing legend Iain Tolhurst. Iain is a pioneer of what he calls stock-free farming, which he explains in more detail at the beginning of this talk. I first heard of Iain when Cleve West spoke about him at the Vegan Gardening Festival last September. If you're interested in hearing more about that event, check out the podcast I released on it on the 25th of September 2018. And if you'd like to hear about Cleve's journey into veganism, I released an interview with him on the 15th of January, and I can't recommend that episode highly enough. In fact, it's received phenomenal feedback and is actually my most downloaded episode to date, so do go back and check that out. It's a real privilege to hear Iain speak about his farm and the unique way he manages it. And although there are some slight background noises, mainly courtesy of the band in the room next door, who unfathomably launched into a rendition of the Top Gun anthem towards the end of Iain's presentation, please try and ignore these minor interruptions because what Iain says is pure gold.
My name's Iain Tolhurst. I've been an organic farmer for over 42 years, and I've been a stock-free organic farmer for almost 30 of those 42 years, so I've had quite a long history of farming. I'm going to take you through in the next 40 odd minutes about what a vegan or a stock-free organic farm is really all about, because this concept is relatively new. We were the first farm in the UK actually to be registered as a stock-free organic farm. So what is a vegan farm? There's different terms. It could be vegan, veganic, stockless or stock-free organic. The word stock-free organic is actually a registered user's word. It's actually linked to a set of specific standards, and these stock-free organic standards were set up in 2002, I think. I can't remember. I was instrumental in getting this set up. I worked very closely with the Vegan Organic Network. I've had a long history of setting standards. I was involved with the Soil Association way back in the 70s and 80s in establishing the organic standards for the UK. The idea of the standard really was to give a credible and certificable system of organic production which completely excluded any livestock inputs. Very few people realise actually how much livestock inputs tend to go into either organically grown or conventionally grown produce. Manures get used a lot. There's a whole lot of material from slaughterhouse waste is used in agriculture. So I was feeling really that we needed to exclude this. I didn't like the idea of these inputs at all into farming. So the farm is bound by certain rules and regulations, and this is something we have as well as our Soil Association accreditation as well. And it's to ensure that there's no livestock kept on the farm for commercial gain. So we wouldn't be allowed to keep cows to milk, chickens, ducks, or anything which had any commercial gain value whatsoever. We could keep animals, but we wouldn't be allowed to exploit those animals. We wouldn't be allowed to send them to slaughterhouse. We wouldn't be allowed to mutilate them or harm them in any way. So it's really completely excludes the use or the exploitation of any animals within a farm system. There's no killing or maiming of any animals. So if we have a pest problem, we try as far as possible to reduce that problem in other means. We don't resort to killing or maiming in any way. There's no blood sports allowed on the farm. We would never allow that even before we got this standard. There's no food for livestock produced. So whereas years ago we used to give away any dodgy potatoes, we used to grow maybe 30, 40 tonne of potatoes a year, and sometimes you get sort of 2 or 3 tonne of waste. We would give those to the local farmer. We don't even do that anymore. That goes back into the compost heap and it gets recycled. So we're not feeding livestock at all. And there's no importation of any animal products. So we don't import animal manure, we don't import any fish blood or bone or feather waste or anything at all which comes from animals. No horse manure, nothing at all. So we've excluded livestock completely from the whole farm system. The photographs, by the way, are all of my farm. So stock-free organic, we have to comply with the Soil Association standards anyway in order to be able to use the word organic. and we're inspected annually by the Soil Association, who do an additional inspection which is linked to the stock-free organic standards. 2006, that's when it's established, and that's administered by the Vegan Organic Network. So we have an inspection every year. It's a very complex and intrusive day. We have a whole day of an inspector come in and look at the farm. They go into our records, they do an audit right through. They can follow a crop right through from the seed to the final sales to make sure that we're adhering to all the organic and the stock-free organic standards. So why stock-free? You know, this is something which very few people have heard anything about. The first point really is we're not using ghost acres. Now, ghost acres is land which you would take from somewhere else in the form of manure or fertility. So most organic growers, because they don't have livestock, would be bringing manure from another farm. That farm may not even be organic. There are certain rules about how the animals are kept in terms of animal welfare, but it doesn't have to be organic. That's a way of importing land. So we call it ghost acres. What you're actually doing is you're bringing someone else's fertility from their farm, depriving their fertility, and replacing it onto your farm. There are some ethical issues around that. There's also some practical issues around that in terms of fertility being displaced. So that's the first point. What we're trying to do really is to create a closed, as near as possibly closed system. The ideal farm would be one that never brings anything in from outside at all, but just produces food. That's probably almost impossible. We have to bring something in. You know, we bring seeds in and a small amount of wood chip. But the idea is to try and get as near as possible to a closed system. The nearer you are to a closed system, the lower your carbon footprint is, the lower the impact on the environment, and potentially the higher the gain for the farm will be. It's very productive. I mean, we are now far more productive than we were 20 years ago before we started this. We have a very high output of produce. We're not a low output farm at all. We produce over 120 tonnes of produce every year. It's a very low carbon footprint, and we've done many studies on the farm. We know a lot about our carbon footprint. We've had various university studies looking specifically at how much carbon we use on the farm, how much we emit and how much we put back. And we have a very clear picture of that. And it's generally a very favourable picture. So we know that the carbon footprint of stock-free organic farming can be very low if it's done properly. There's no reliance on animal culture, so we have no dependency at all on livestock. We have no dependency on manures or any brought-in materials. We can farm without livestock. We do have animals on the farm. We have lots of worms. We have lots of biology. That's our livestock. And it avoids the problems of sourcing inputs. And inputs in farms are problematic. Whatever you bring into a farm has a cost. It has a financial cost. It has an environmental cost. It has a carbon cost, and very often has a social cost. And this is something which often people don't realise. If you're bringing manure from another farm, which is not organic, that farm may well be bringing cereals from somewhere on the other side of the world, where maybe food isn't so abundant, to feed their livestock. And this goes on a lot. Agriculture is very dependent on a huge range of inputs from other parts of the world. Soy is a prime example. Most soil that goes into animal feeds is coming generally from South America, and that leads to deforestation and all the problems that we know that surround that. So it's really trying to avoid the problems of those inputs. So the farm business, we were established in 1976. I don't know if there's anybody old enough to remember 1976. No? Oh, you do? Well, from where I am, you don't look old enough, but I'm sure you are. 1976, for those of you who don't remember, was the last time we had a serious drought in this country, and it was really serious. It went on for 6 months. It was far drier and hotter than it was last summer, so I remember it very well. Our present site has been stock-free for 33 years. We've been on this farm now for 33 years. We farmed previously in Cornwall. We produce over 80 crops with 80 different vegetables, of which there may well be 2 or 3 crops of each. We actually do over 350 separate sowings every year. So on average, we actually sow 1 crop every day, which means that in the summer we sow 5 or 6 a day sometimes, and in the winter we hardly sow any at all. And we're producing between 100 and 120 tonnes an annum of mixed vegetables. Last year was our best year ever. We had the most amazing crops. We're not sure what the final total is, but it's well in excess of 120 tonnes. Just potatoes and squash alone yielded over 45 tonnes. So the yields are good. It's a self-sufficient system. We're not dependent on hardly any inputs from outside. virtually everything we produce is sold within a 20-mile radius. In fact, over 75% is sold within an 8-mile radius, and we're trying to bring that down to 100% within a 7 or 8-mile radius. I'm also involved in advisory. I advise other farms. I don't know if you've heard the story of Jay, who gave away 70 odd cows last year to a sanctuary. I was the advisor for Jay. In fact, I still am the advisor for Bradley Nook Farm. I'm going there in a couple of weeks' time to help them on vegetable production. We also run seminars on the farm, which range a whole range of subjects, but primarily based around stock-free organic growing, green manures, use of compost, plant raising, those sort of things. We have farm walks. I do farm walks as a very regular activity. It goes right through the summer. And we have several different trials we're conducting. We presently have 4 trials going on the farm looking at green manures and the use of ramule wood chip. So the farm is quite a busy place. It's not just about producing vegetables. We have quite a lot of people there at different times. The farm is very much based around what we call functional agricultural biodiversity, FAB. It kind of works. And it's very much about a systems approach. And one of the questions I often get from people is, how do you control pests and diseases? Well, actually, it's quite simple. We allow the natural predation of the area, the natural insects, and natural flora and fauna become a part of that. We work very closely with nature. So we try as far as possible to have no intervention in terms of pests and disease. We don't apply anything. We don't use any organic insecticides or pesticides or anything at all. We use purely biological natural systems. And this is really very much dependent on the way we manage the whole farm. So the whole farm is really worked as a whole system. It's looked at as one complete unit, and every part of that unit is interdependent on the other. So the soil is the most important part of what we do, so much of our effort really goes into managing the soil. But what we really do overall, we're managing biodiversity, and biodiversity is the main component of the farm. The vegetables are a byproduct of that. The biodiversity comes first. So we've built the whole farm system purely on the basis of encouraging biodiversity in every form. So it's not something you bolt onto a farm, it's something which you make as part of that farm. So our marketing is, as I said, mostly local. We only sell within a small radius of the farm. We have a bot scheme which takes up around 50% of our entire production. That goes every week of the year. We don't stop. We go right through 52 weeks of the year. We have a farm shop which sells about 25% of our production. That's been going up over the last few years. It's becoming quite busy. I've just recently built a new one and opened it a few weeks ago, and it's suddenly become very busy. We also supply, we go to a farmers market. We do 2 farmers markets every 3 to 4 weeks. And we also supply some local shops and a few other smaller bot schemes that operate in our area. People that generally only grow quite small areas, they come to us in the winter for some of the staple crops like potatoes, onions, carrots, beetroot, things that we grow on a larger scale. So local is all marketing is very much local. This is our field. We have 2 fields. We're very close to the River Thames. We're in South Oxfordshire. It's a very pretty, delightful part of the country. It's quite poor land. It's not good quality horticultural land at all. It's actually grade 3, which may not mean much, but grade 3 is, well, it's kind of like very mediocre, and it's only generally suitable for grassland or trees. It's stony. We've had to work to make it good. We're just on the edge of the floodplain. You can see in the background there, that's the River Thames, which very occasionally it does flood. It comes very close to our field. It comes within a few yards of our field some years. We have a range of biodiversity features there, some of which we've brought in and added, and some of which are part of the natural landscape of that area. We have in total 17 acres of field, and these are some of the crops, by no means all of them, but some of the crops we've got top left is potatoes. Despite what everybody tells you about potatoes in the diet, it's still our most popular selling crop. It's the one we sell the most of. We sell around 25 tonnes of potatoes every year. It accounts for pretty much 20% of our entire vegetable production is potatoes. This may come as a surprise to a lot of people, but it is a very popular crop. Top right is brassica. This is actually Brussels sprouts, a very important food family. I mean, there's thousands of different brassica. We grow a huge range, everything imaginable, from the tiny little radishes up to huge big Brussels sprouts and colettes and everything in between. Bottom right is onions. These have just been harvested. They've been pushed into rows for drying. We dry them in the field. And then the middle picture is squash, which we only started growing about 30 years ago. We could hardly give them away. Now they've become very popular. It's a really popular crop, and we sell a lot of squash. In fact, this last year we had the biggest ever squash crop. We produced over about 14 or 15 tons from just over an acre. It's a very productive crop. It's a beautiful crop. It can be slightly difficult depending on the weather, but last year was perfect. And then we have leeks. We grow about 30,000 leeks a year. These are field crops. This is stuff we do mostly with machinery and relatively low labour input. And we have a rotation of crops. We have a 7-year rotation, and we have green manures within that rotation. Strawberries, we started off 40 odd years ago growing strawberries, and then we gave up for various reasons, and now we've gone back into it because we have a farm shop. It goes really well. The big problem with strawberries is finding anybody to pick them. Most people in this country don't like the idea of picking strawberries for more than about an hour. So we have a continual labour problem with strawberries. This is the ground. That's kind of normal. That's not fixed, that picture. It's full of stones. It's poor quality land, but even poor quality soil can be made very fertile if you treat it in the right way, and we've made this soil very fertile. We have agroforestry. This picture was taken just the first year it was planted, but we planted agroforestry 5 years ago. It's now starting to look much more mature, and this is in one of our fields. We planted over 600 trees, which includes some apple trees. It's not a high density planting. The idea is that we're going to grow vegetables between the rows of trees, and the trees are there primarily to improve the biodiversity, to bring more carbon into the system. We're really trying to get as much carbon as possible in, and also the trees provide some other materials. We have wood chip, the ability to chip some of the trees, coppice, and there's some fruits as well. Plus there's a whole range of biological interest in terms of insects which will invade the site. We've seen a big change already within the last 2 or 3 years in terms of the insect activity. This has been heavily monitored. We have 3 different research establishments counting and monitoring every aspect of this. I won't bore you with the details, but we've got data of every single beetle that's ever moved anywhere near these trees in the last 3 years, how far they move, what species they are, how long they interact. There's a big study. This is the first time really that a really thorough study has been done into integrating forestry within horticulture. So we're very pleased to be a part of that. This was it in the summer, so you can see we're cropping between the trees. We've got more or less normal cropping. We've had to reduce the area slightly because of the space the trees take up, but we're carrying on cropping as normal, and we're hoping to see a range of benefits. We're only really just starting to see some of those benefits now, but the benefits will accumulate over a period of time. The hills in the background, that's the Chiltern Hills. We're at the bottom of the Chiltern Hills. Within the tree line we have a range of crops, so we're trying out, we're crazily experimental on our farm. We're actually growing crops under the trees in some of them. And this one we've got flowers. We've got perennial flowers which we've raised from seed, and they're cut flowers. We do some flower selling as well. Flowers can sell quite well at certain times. We're also growing things like rhubarb, artichokes, and a few other things under the trees to see if there's any possibility of cropping the land under the trees for a period of time. It complicates things, but it does mean it increases the overall output of the farm. And then as well as the fields, we have a walled garden. This is a very ancient walled garden. In fact, the wall was built just after the Civil War, about 1680, but it was a farm before that. This bit of land, as far as we know, and it's difficult to go back very far, but as far as we know, this has been a farm and it's been used in terms of vegetable growing for well over 2,000 years. So, it's had a very long history of production. It's gone through all sorts of periods of time. If only you could go back and study the whole history, it'd be fantastic, but there's a lot of history missing. It was derelict when I took it on. It was a result of a long-term neglect. It hadn't been used for 6 or 7 years. Most of the old greenhouses had to go. They were completely derelict, and we've now got some more modern tunnel cropping. But this is the place we do all our small-scale intensive growing. Again, it's all stock-free. There's no animal inputs whatsoever. And we have a rotation in the same way we have a rotation in the field. We have a 9-year rotation, and we grow a range of crops all year round. The tunnels are particularly useful for winter cropping, and we'd be quite struggling to keep our customers' supply without them during the winter. This is from above, and this is in the autumn when a lot of it is gone back into green manure. We only crop the garden mostly during the summer. It's used from now until the end of August, and then we put it back to green manure, which keeps it safe and fertile for the winter. We continue to crop in the tunnels and greenhouses. We have about 2,000 square metres of, no, that's wrong. We have, almost 2,000 square metres of protected cropping. So we have quite a large area which we can continue to crop during the winter, and we have a different rotation in tunnels. Just a few of the crops we grow. Most of this is done quite small scale. We don't use much in the way of machinery. It's hugely labour intensive. This is the problem with growing on this scale. It takes a lot of labour, but it is very productive, and it produces a small area of crops which we tend not to want to grow in the field because they're too fiddly. So the higher value cropping. This is some of the tunnel cropping. We crop these all year round. There's almost never a break. It's continuous cropping. In fact, over the course of a rotation, which is 5 years, we have about 17 or 18 different crops. So we have more than 2 crops every year. So as soon as one is out, another one's in. Top left is carrots. We just sowed these 2 weeks ago. They're only about that big at the minute, 3 weeks ago. That'd be our first carrot crop, and we'll be harvesting those from the end of May right through till early July, and then we start on the field ones, and then we have another crop in the field. We have 3 crops of carrots every year. This is really important because otherwise we wouldn't have carrots at all between, we're almost about to run out, but so between the end of March and end of July, really, before the field ones would be ready. So the natural season for carrots is only for 9 months. Now, I think everybody here would appreciate the fact that they want carrots for 12 months a year. It's a really important crop. Very few people realise that carrots are only available from UK farms for about 9 months, and then they come from abroad. There are no carrots between April and July, unless you can do something like this. So this is very much specialist cropping. Cucumbers, top right, really popular crop, very easy to grow, fantastic yield. We usually end up with too many, so we sometimes pickle them if we get too many. Bottom left is both the bottom ones are winter salads. So this is salads we grow during the winter. They're sown in the 3rd week of August, and they crop from end of September right through to now. We're still picking them now, and we will be for another 2 or 3 weeks. And then we replace those with other crops. So as soon as one crop comes out, another one goes in. And we're feeding the soil here primarily with compost. We use some green manures, but not so much in tunnels. Propagation, we do all our own propagation. Most propagation compost, or substrate as it should be called, contains, particularly if it's organic, contains fish blood and bone. Not everybody realises that because the ingredients are not on the packet ever. They don't put ingredients on compost packets. We decided over 25 years ago to take that out of the system. There was this BSE crisis coming around, and we realised that this was not good news at all. We'd always been slightly worried about it anyway, so we took it out and we replaced it with making our own material. And we make our own material from compost, which is made from wood chip, purely wood chip, nothing else. And this is something we've pioneered. We have done a lot of work on this, and we've also done a lot of trials and demonstrations on using wood chip compost. It's a very good, viable alternative to peat-based materials, which is what we really want to avoid. So we produce in this little greenhouse, which is not really, it's hardly any longer than this room and half the size. It's half the size of this room. We produce over 80, 60, 70 odd thousand plants a year in modules, but we also produce another 70 or 80,000 plants a year outside in the garden, which we take to the field. They're called peg plants, they're bare roots, things like all the winter brassica, leeks. We grow probably 25, 30,000 leeks a year and 25,000 odd brassica plus some other bits and pieces. They're grown outside, but a lot of it is grown in the greenhouse. And if you look at now the picture on the bottom left, although this picture was taken about 10 years ago, it's looking just like that now, today. In fact, that's how it looks. We have plants at that stage, and it's an intensive propagation system. We wouldn't be able to produce the crops we do unless we had this fertility on the farm. Trials and surveys, so yeah, I mentioned that already. We do a whole range of trials and surveys on the farm. This was 2017, it changes from year to year, but we're closely linked to the Organic Research Centre, have been for well over 30 years. There's the agroforestry, which has been monitored and checked. We've also been looking at green manures and earthworms. Green manures are really important in organic systems, particularly ones that exclude livestock materials. We've been looking at varieties in terms of strawberries. We've always done variety trials into a whole range of different crops, but at the moment we're doing some specifically with strawberries in terms of disease resistance. We're looking at ramule wood chip trials. This has been going on for the last 3 years and carries on for another 3 years. 6-year trial is a very long trial in UK. Very rarely do trials go as long as that because of the difficulty of funding. Ramule wood chip I'll hopefully explain a bit more later on. And we're doing propagation media trials. That's the compost we use for plant raising. And alternative crops. We're looking at crops to extend the rotation in tunnels, looking at some of the more novel crops which are a possibility. So composting wood chip, this is something we've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years, and we were the first farm ever in UK to really concentrate on composting wood chip. Everybody said this is impossible, you cannot compost wood, there's no nitrogen. Well, I beg to differ. I could see that piles of wood chip were rotting on their own with no intervention at all when they were left, so I thought, well, it has to work. And we've made this work. It's been incredibly successful. We produce around 250 cubic metres a year. It all comes from very much local source. It's mostly from one tree surgeon who works closely with what we're doing, and it's a mixture of different trees. Green manures are a really important part of our whole biological systems approach, and we have green manures right through the rotation. Every year we have green manure at some point in the rotation, as well as cropping. And what we've done on our farm is we've pioneered the use of green manures within cropping at the same time. So you can grow a crop and have a green manure, so you can build fertility and have a crop at the same time. This is a completely new approach. It's never been tried before in commercial situation. So we're really depending on green manures because of their fertility building properties. It's a valuable contributor to biodiversity. The green manure is not there just for fertility building, it's also there because it brings in a whole range of insects, and it also brings a whole range of biology and fungi to the soil. Everything we do is really about the soil, and the greater the range of plants you grow in the soil, the greater the range of fungi and bacteria you encourage. If you only ever grow one crop, like grass or wheat in the field, you get a very limited range of fungi and bacteria, and you get big problems of pest and disease. If you have a huge range of plants, and this includes weeds as well, we consider weeds a really important component of this whole fertility cycle, you improve the natural fungal activity of soil, which improves the natural biological resistance that plants have to pests and diseases. This is a really important point, and it's only really in the last literally no more than 5 or 6 years that conventional agriculture has suddenly started to realise that actually there's something going on in the soil which they didn't realise how important it was. And this has been neglected completely from agricultural systems. So we're really dependent on the biodiversity of the soil, and green manures play a really important role in that. So it's recycling nutrients. Green manures will bring nutrients up from deeper in the soil, bring them back where they've been lost, maybe in previous cropping times, even we're talking generations ago, nutrition's been lost in soil, and green manures can bring that back, and they can process nutrients that wouldn't normally be accessible because of the fungi and the bacteria. And we're really keen to recycle all farm losses, so we minimise losses to the absolute, minimum, of course, in terms of compost application. So any waste material goes through the compost heap, goes back on the ground. We don't throw anything away, we don't bury anything deep, it all goes back in the compost heap and it goes back to the surface of the soil. We never turn anything, it's always on the surface. As far as possible, we're trying to exercise a closed system, and we're looking at ways of growing increasingly our own wood chip, because at the minute we're bringing wood chip in from local sources. We're looking at ways of reducing that to the point where perhaps at some point we could eliminate it, and we're looking at how many trees do we need to grow on the farm to make that work, and we're coming up with some interesting data. We are cropping 70% of the farm, so although we have extensive areas of green manure. If you look at certain times of year, you wonder where anything grows because it's nearly all green manure. We do actually crop 70% of the farm, so 70% of the farm is in crops during the course of the year. A lot of crops are only in the ground for 12, 15 weeks. You take potatoes, which I'm going to plant next week. The early ones we'll be digging up in 10 weeks, 11 weeks time, and then that ground goes back into green manure. So we never ever leave soil uncovered during the winter. The compost is applied at 50 cubic metres a hectare, which may not mean much to you if you've only got a garden, but it's about 5 litres per square metre. It's not very much. It's sort of a third of a bucket full over a square metre. It's quite a small amount. And it goes within 2 years of a 7-year rotation. So when we've got green manure crop, we have green manure permanent for 2 years of the rotation. The compost goes on to that point of the rotation. We never apply compost to bare soil. The exception to that is in tunnels. But other than that, we never apply compost on bare earth. We certainly never plough it in or dig it in. It's a terrible waste. Most of it tends to go on to the field cropping because it's a large area, it's 17 acres, but we do reserve some for tunnel crops and the garden area, and also we use some for the propagation material. There's a trial going on here, propagation trial we did some years ago using the heat from the composting process. The wood chip gives a lot of heat. We get up to 70 or even 80 degrees. We did some trials on raising plants. This was taken in December. You can't see very well, but it's a thermometer there which registered during the day a temperature of 24 and during the night a temperature of 17, whereas outside it was minus 10 at night. So there's a huge amount of heat. So we're looking at this really in terms of not just producing good organic material, but also in terms of producing energy and heat, which we could be using for plant raising. So ramial wood chip is small branch wood. This is timber which is usually coming from trees that have been doctored, cut, trimmed back. Occasionally it would be trees that are cut down completely, but most of those tend to be quite large. We never use large timber. That goes into either firewood or timber production. We just use the small wood. It's about that size or less. It's chipped. We try to avoid too much conifer. Conifer can be problematic because it contains a lot of phthalates and turpentines. It doesn't rot very well. It can upset the biological process, so we tend to keep that to a minimum, no more than 20%. We apply it to the surface of the soil. It goes on to a green manure crop. It never goes on, again, we never put this on bare soil. It goes on to soil which is already biologically active. It's in green manure. There's a lot of fungal activity there because when you have green manure, you have this huge family of fungi and bacteria anyway. And the soil is stable. There's a big earthworm population. There's lots of microbes to process it. It goes on the surface, quite low amounts. It's usually done in the spring when the ground is dry enough to drive on. It suits a minimum no-till system. We tend to be very low on tillage. We only use tillage occasionally within the rotation. It's a really good source of carbon. Trees are one of the best sources of soil carbon anywhere. The best soils in the world are soils that have been in forest for many, many years. They are always high in carbon. The danger is that those forests, because they are so high in carbon, they get used for agriculture. And once they've been deforested, cut down and farmed for 10 years, they're usually finished because nothing gets put back. These soils often are very fragile and can lose their carbon very quickly. So we're very keen to make sure we keep our carbon levels up, and we've been monitoring carbon levels right across the farm for decades, and we've seen a very gradual increase over that time, which is very encouraging because horticulture is very demanding on soil. It takes a lot out to grow vegetables. We're really looking at improving the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, and the mycorrhiza. Mycorrhizas are really important fungi because it encourages plants to find their own nutrient, particularly phosphate. So although our soil is naturally low in phosphate due to its geology, it's actually very high in the ability of plants to find the phosphate that's there because it has the mycorrhiza association. And it improves nutrients. I mean, wood chip brings nutrients in. It's not high in nutrient, it's quite low in nutrient, but it brings small amounts of nutrient in. There's a whole range of nutrients available in wood chip. Within the tunnels and greenhouses, we also use this relay green manuring. And we do it outside more, but we use it in the tunnels. And this is a way of bringing the green manure into a crop when it's still growing. It's really good for improving the pest-predator balance, so green manures encourage biological activity. It can control some weeds, and it protects soil over winter. It's particularly good outdoors where we sow it into vegetable crops in the field, so all our winter brassica are undersown with a mixture of Phacelia and one or two other things, keeps the soil covered and allows stability in the soil. That's really important. This is an example where we're growing courgettes within a living mulch. This living mulch was grown the year before, because in that position we had climbing French beans growing, and this green manure was sown into the French beans the previous year, so it's been there for 2 years already. And then the second year we're planting courgettes, and then the third year we have a complete break. So this is a way of bringing green manures into a horticultural system, and this can be worked on any scale, really. The understory, we take great pride in our understory, and our understory is often green manures, or it could be a mixture of green manures and some weeds, because weeds are essential in a system. We do discourage weeds at certain points, but we also encourage them at other points in the rotation. Once the crop's grown, we don't mind weed competition at all. It doesn't affect the crop. The crop's quite happy. In this situation where we're growing squash, we grow 2,000 plants a year, and we undersow this crop in the middle of summer, in mid-July, with a mixture of green manure. There's 20 different species of plant there, some legumes and other flowers as well, and that will stay in now for a whole 2 years, following 2 years of rotation. This is the end of our rotation. This is the last crop. So the rotation is really important to how we manage the soil, and this is a time when the soil is allowed to be a resting period, a rejuvenation period. We'll get lots of insects moving in, there'll be lots of biology going on there, and there'll be lots of ground beetles which control slugs. So the whole system is not just about fertility, it's about managing pest and disease problems. One of our main features of the field is not very big, it's 10 acres, well there's one at 10 acres, one at 7. However, I felt it was still too big, so we divide it up into smaller areas, and we use living beetle banks, and these stay in place for maybe 5-6 years, and then they get a bit messy and we start again next to it and tie that piece up. They're really important because they connect all the hedges around the field. We have, within 17 acres, we have over 2,000 metres of hedge, which is in itself very rich, biologically diverse. So we want that hedge to become part of the field, and the only way to connect the hedge to the field is through beetle banks, because at certain times, you can see here we have bare soil. We just ploughed this way for potatoes. One side we have green manure where it's biologically rich, the other side has been partly damaged because of the cultivations. This ensures a balance and enables land to be recolonised by insects and various fungi. We also have short-term refuges which are for insects. This is within a green manure crop. The green manure is mowed on a regular basis during the summer, but we leave strips unmown because they're biologically very diverse. It gives somewhere for insects to shelter and to have a place of safety away from the mower. And it allows rapid recolination of that green manure crop. Wildflower mix. We use a whole range of wildflowers, but primarily we're looking at indigenous wildflowers. We use what would naturally be growing on that site. And we've done a lot of research into this, and if we'd gone back to that site 300 years ago before agriculture became intensive, there would have been over 200 different flowers growing on that site. And when we first went there 30 years ago, we could only find about 7. So, despite the fact it hadn't been farmed much for some years. So it was very, very low in biological diversity. We're now up to about 75 or 80. Some of that's come naturally, but some of it's also been introduced by ourselves in terms of reintroducing some of the weeds that were there originally. We think weeds are really important. Actually, I think weeds have got a great future, despite what everyone else thinks about weeds. And flowering crops. Flowering crops are really important. We manage cabbage white butterfly problems entirely by the way we manage crops. We have no caterpillar problem. We grow 25,000 brassica, and you'd have to spend hours before you found more than a handful of caterpillars during the summer. We have a really good system of controlling them through natural predation, and that involves leaving the plants to flower, leaving the brassica to flower. Very few people realise once you cut a cabbage, it will regrow, and it gets this tall, and it flowers. And in itself, it looks actually quite beautiful. It encourages a lot of insects, and some of those insects live on caterpillars, and they will pupate, move back into hedges, pupate, come out, and parasitise the caterpillars. So you can see the bottom left-hand picture, these little tiny sort of little cocoons. And this is the parasitic wasp, which is now waiting to come out. And if we destroy that crop in the spring, if we mow it off or plough it in, we lose all that natural predation. So we've identified at least 6 or 7 different parasitic wasps, one of which is actually considered quite rare, and they stay within our farm because of the way we manage them. And as a result of the management, we have 0 problems with cabbage white butterflies. Weeds, I've already mentioned, weeds are a really important part of what we do. We keep ground clean up to a certain point. When crop is young, we have machinery for hoeing, we do by hand sometimes, even occasional hand weeding. But after a certain point, once the crop's established, we allow the weeds to develop because actually they're really important because they contain a whole range of insects. But also it's the diversity of the roots. They have their own unique fungal activity within the roots which encourages good plant health. And then field boundaries. The boundaries for us are every bit as important as the piece we crop because they contain the bioreserve, if you like, of all the insects that we need in our system. The more insects we have, the better I like it. If I see a shortage of insects, I want to know why, because the more insects we have, the more ability nature has to control the pests. Pests only become a problem when the system's unbalanced. So what we really do with the hedges, we connect them back to the field through the beetle banks and the way we manage them. And we only cut them every 3rd or 4th year to stop them because they would eventually take the field over. And we encourage the borders along the edge. We don't mow the last 1.5 meters by the hedge. We allow that to flower and set seed. And we even have a system of encouraging the seeds to sow and regenerate themselves. So the way we manage the field boundaries is critical to the field itself. And then the heavy carbon, we're busy planting trees because we need this long-term heavy carbon. We have a use for wood chip and for materials based on wood. Hedges, I think I mentioned we have over 2,000 metres of hedge, and this was a picture taken many years ago. In fact, this was taken 15 years ago where we just coppiced the hedge. It was the first coppice we'd ever done. We planted it 8-9 years previously. It was planted primarily to produce material for use. It's been coppiced, we've taken it away and it's grown back. We've actually done it 3 times now. We just coppiced it last year and harvested, I can't remember exactly, but about 70 cubic metres of wood chip plus 30-40 cubic metres of firewood. So it's been very productive. It's really an important part of the whole system because it's carbon. The carbon is so critical to what we do. And then trees, I've already mentioned the trees. So the agroforestry really is about improving the carbon content of the farm. It's a relatively slow process, but it speeds up as the trees become established. We've just done some pruning this a few weeks ago of some of the trees. We're now having to start cutting some of them back. And then shelter belts. We've established several shelter belts on the farm. It's quite windy in certain parts, particularly on the western side. And those shelter belts are a mixture of fruiting trees, so we have some fruiting as well, but they're also a mixture of trees which eventually we can coppice, and we have started coppice, and they supply wood chip. I mean, trees will grow forever. There's no stopping a tree. If you manage it properly, it will produce forever more, and it produces a lot of carbon, and it produces a lot of other really useful benefits to the field. Permanent coppice, I planted, top left, I planted coppice 14 years ago. Bottom right is 2 or 3 years ago. It's been coppiced 3 times. We've just coppiced a row last week, and we're getting very good yields of timber. Some of this goes into wood chip, which goes back onto the land. This was a bit of the farm which we couldn't use. It floods in the winter, it's very wet. So it's a piece of land which otherwise would have had no purpose. Very briefly, I'm running out of time. We've done a lot of work on our carbon footprint, and we like to measure what goes in and what goes out from the farm. So this was something we did with some university researchers a few years ago, and we continue to do it on a biannual basis. It's quite a lot of work, actually. We're looking at really how much the farm will sequester, so how much carbon we can take from the atmosphere and put back into the soil. This is important because farms have the ability to trap carbon and put it back in the soil. There's a huge amount of potential carbon entrapment in soil which has not been recognised. I mean, most farms are losing carbon, so they're adding to the greenhouse problem. Whereas it is possible to farm, produce food and put carbon back at the same time, but you have to farm in a very specific way. So we're looking at how much we've gained over a period of time, and this was over a 2-year period. The hedges, that puts in 17%. We have a lot of hedge compared to the field area. The fields are quite small. Our biggest field is 10 acres, which by modern standards is very small. So the hedge actually occupies quite a large part of the field. The coppice is tiny. It's less than 5% of the field area, but it produces a huge amount of carbon because it's carbon neutral, and it's a very useful form of carbon. We have field margins. This is a bit of grass. We have a strip all around the perimeter of the field. We use it for access, for machinery, and for passenger foot traffic. And we have soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is the biggest one. Because our levels are going up quite gradually, you've only got to raise your soil carbon by 1% to get a huge figure. It really is big because it's over a large area. This is over 17 acres. It's 700,000 square meters. It's a big piece of land, and a very small increase in carbon actually manages to make a lot of carbon on your sequestration. So we've also looked at the total emissions of the farm. Now the farm, in terms of all the energy it uses, the diesel for production, the diesel for transport, the materials that get used, the timber for posts, the packaging, electricity, everything, the whole farm is measured in terms of what it uses and how much carbon it emits into the atmosphere. And we came up with this figure of 16 tons, and we'd actually sequestered 21. So we actually put back 5 tons of carbon that year. Now that was a good year. Some years it's the other way around. Some years we have a carbon deficit or carbon positive. But it's not always a perfect picture. It depends how much we spend and how much we invest in machinery. I'm just about to buy a brand new piece of machinery. That will bring my carbon footprint up by quite a factor for several years. It takes 10 years to write it off. So we're very keen to look at the carbon footprint and measure it from year to year. Right, that's the end. Well, the last one is this picture, which I'd like to put up. We have a lot of red kites in the area. It's very highly populated. When I first went there, we had just 2 or 3, and now we've got about 40. And they love our farm. And the reason they love our farm is it's full of earthworms. Every time we turn ground over, this lot turn up from miles away and gorge on the earthworms. And it's a sign of a really healthy, productive soil. You have large populations of earthworms. And for me, this is like the top of the food chain. This kind of tells me my farm's okay, it's working well, because they never go to the farm next door that's not organic. They never ever visit it. There's something obviously completely different, in the same way that the barn owls stay our side the river. They don't go across the river to the non-organic farm. So nature can really show you some really powerful messages about the way you're behaving on your piece of land.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Vegan Organic Network for allowing me to come along and record the event. They're doing great work to promote vegan organic growing, including disseminating information and supporting those who choose to try this method of growing. You can find out more about their work by visiting veganorganic.net, and I'll put links in the show notes about where to find them online and on social media.